Hey guys, when we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine lives that were brief, harsh, and almost inevitably cut short. But the truth is stranger and, in a way, more human. Life expectancy in the medieval world can look shockingly low on paper, yet many people still grew old. The real story isn't just about dying young. It's about what the numbers hide: infancy, hunger, work, disease, and the quiet ways medieval people tried to protect one another from a world with few safety nets. If you enjoy calm, long-form history that takes its time and tries to get the details right, consider subscribing. It helps more curious listeners find these deeper dives, and it means you won't miss the next story when you're in the mood for thoughtful history in the background. To understand what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, we need to begin with a simple but easily misunderstood point. Life expectancy is not the same thing as a natural lifespan. Life expectancy is an average, and in a medieval context that average is dragged down, often dramatically, by the sheer number of children who never reached adulthood. When modern readers see figures like 30 years, or even less in some places and periods, it can sound as if most people drop dead at 30. In reality, those numbers are telling us something else. They are telling us how dangerous the earliest years of life were, and how much medieval survival depended on getting through the narrow gate of infancy and early childhood. In most medieval communities, the first year of life was the most perilous. Newborns faced risks that are easy to forget in the age of antibiotics, refrigeration, and clean water. Infection could begin at birth. A mild fever could become fatal. Diarrheal illness, often linked to contaminated water or food, could dehydrate a baby quickly. Even in households that were careful and attentive, small bodies had little margin for error. Maternal health mattered too. When mothers were malnourished, exhausted by labor, or weakened by repeated pregnancies, infants were more vulnerable from the start. And for the mother herself, childbirth carried real danger. A complicated delivery, bleeding, or infection could kill, and the loss of a mother could then endanger the baby's chance of surviving as well. Life expectancy, then, is shaped at the cradle as much as it is shaped in the fields or on the battlefield. If a child survived the first few years, the odds of reaching adulthood improved, but they were never secure. Childhood illness remained common. So did accidents. Fires, open hearths, wells, animals, and tools were part of everyday life, not safely boxed away. And medieval families often lived close together, sometimes in cramped dwellings, making it easier for respiratory infections to spread. Yet we should also recognize something that medieval people understood well. Survival was communal. Children were not raised in isolation. Neighbors, relatives, and wider kin networks mattered. In towns, guilds and parish communities could provide modest support in hard times. In villages, shared labor and mutual obligation, sometimes informal, sometimes enforced by custom, helped households endure lean seasons. These networks did not eliminate risk, but they could soften it, and that in turn affected who lived long enough to become an adult. Once adulthood arrived, the picture becomes more complex and, in a sense, more recognizable. Medieval adults did not live in a constant state of imminent death. Many endured long working lives, People married, had children, argued over land boundaries, attended church, paid rents, traveled to markets, and worried about the same practical things most societies worry about: food prices, health, reputation, and whether the next season would be kind. For those who made it into their 20s, it was entirely possible to reach their 50s, 60s, or beyond. We have records, wills, court documents, monastic registers, and memorial inscriptions that show older adults moving through the medieval world. The point is not that medieval life was comfortable by modern standards. It often wasn't. The point is that average life expectancy at birth is a misleading headline if we don't explain the underlying distribution of deaths across the life course. Food sits at the center of that life course. Medieval diets varied enormously by region, class, season, and local ecology. But for many ordinary people, the year was a cycle of adequacy and anxiety. When harvests were good, people ate better. When they were poor, diets narrowed. Hunger wasn't always the dramatic image of starvation. It could also be a slow thinning of meals, a gradual weakening that made the body less able to resist infection. In some years, famine conditions arrived through crop failure, war disruption, excessive rain, drought, plant disease, or simple bad luck compounded by poor storage. In those moments, mortality could spike across ages, but the young and the frail were hit hardest. Adults might survive a hungry year, but carry forward weakened health that shortened later life. And when multiple bad years arrived together, communities could be pushed beyond their ability to cope. Work also shaped longevity. The Middle Ages were labor-intensive, and the work was physical. In the countryside, where most people lived for much of the medieval period, bodies were tools. Plowing, digging, harvesting, hauling, herding, and processing food all required strength and endurance. Over time, that labor left marks: arthritis, back problems, joint damage, and chronic pain. Medieval people rarely retired in a modern sense. They might shift to lighter tasks with age or rely more on family, but many worked until they could not. In towns, artisans faced different hazards: smoke, dust, repetitive strain, toxic materials in certain trades, and crowded living conditions. None of this necessarily caused immediate death, but it shaped the quality and length of life, and it determined who became vulnerable when disease arrived. Disease, of course, is the great wild card in medieval life expectancy. For long stretches, endemic illnesses, those constantly present, were part of the background. Fevers of many kinds, respiratory infections, parasites, skin infections, and periodic outbreaks that swept through communities. Medical knowledge existed, and medieval practitioners could be skilled observers, but they lacked the tools to identify pathogens, prevent transmission effectively, or treat bacterial infections reliably. Remedies could soothe symptoms, and care itself mattered, yet many diseases simply ran their course. Then, at intervals, came epidemic shocks, sudden waves that could kill in large numbers and reorder society. In these moments, life expectancy, whether calculated by modern historians or felt emotionally by medieval people, could plunge. The most famous example is the Black Death of the mid-14th century, but it is not the only one. Epidemics could return repeatedly, and different diseases struck different age groups with different severity. The medieval world learned, again and again, that life could be stable for a time, then sharply fragile. Yet even here, it helps to avoid the temptation to flatten the Middle Ages into a single dark picture. Risk did not fall evenly. Status mattered. Wealthier households generally had better diets, more secure housing, and better access to care. They could sometimes leave an infected area or isolate more effectively, though not always. Clergy and monks lived in communities that could provide steady food and shelter, but they also lived close together, and their caregiving roles could expose them to illness. Urban residents often faced higher disease burdens than rural villagers because of density and sanitation challenges. Though rural life carried its own dangers, accidents, seasonal hunger, and limited access to specialized help, even the calendar mattered. Winter could bring respiratory illness and food scarcity. Late summer could bring other infections. In other words, medieval life expectancy was not one number. It was a shifting outcome produced by environment, economy, social structure, and sheer chance. Women's life expectancy had its own distinct pressures. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most significant repeated risks of adult female life. A woman might experience many pregnancies across her reproductive years, and each one carried danger. Complications could occur with little warning. Childbirth could be swift and uncomplicated, or it could turn fatal in hours. Even when a mother survived, repeated births could weaken the body, especially if food was limited and rest was scarce. That said, women were not simply doomed by biology. Their survival also depended on social support, the spacing of pregnancies, local practices, and the resources of their household. The medieval record reminds us that many women did live into older age, managed property, acted as witnesses, ran workshops, and held respected positions within their communities. If we step back, the most honest way to describe medieval life expectancy is to say that the Middle Ages had a steep survival curve. The danger was front-loaded. The earliest years were the most lethal. After that, survival became more likely, but still vulnerable to shocks. Famine, epidemic, and the constant wear of labor. This is why historians sometimes talk about life expectancy at different ages. Life expectancy at birth could be low because of infant mortality, while life expectancy at age 10 or 20 could be substantially higher. It's a way of capturing what medieval families already knew in practice. If a child made it through the early years, there was real hope for a long life. And what did old age mean in the medieval world? It was not defined by a pension system or a fixed retirement age. It was often defined by function, when a person could no longer perform heavy labor, when eyesight failed, when chronic pain limited movement, when memory slipped, or when the community began to treat someone as an elder. Some older adults remained active in work and social life. Others depended on family, charity, or the church. Medieval charity existed not only as a moral ideal but as a practical mechanism. Alms, hospital foundations, and parish support could keep the vulnerable alive. At the same time, the system was imperfect, and hardship could be severe. Longevity did not guarantee comfort. Surviving to old age could mean living with disability in a world with limited medical relief. So when you see a medieval life expectancy figure that seems shockingly low, it helps to hear the human story underneath it. The number is real, But it is not telling you that medieval adults routinely died at 30. It is telling you that childhood was dangerous, that disease and hunger could strike hard, and that the medieval world contained sharp contrasts. Stability and sudden catastrophe, communal support and brutal scarcity, resilience and vulnerability. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not a single experience shared by everyone. It was a spectrum shaped by where you lived, what you ate, what work you did, whether epidemics visited your town, and whether you survived the earliest years when life was at its most fragile. In the next part, we'll walk through what those pressures looked like on the ground, village and town, rich and poor, and how events like famine years and plague outbreaks could reshape an entire generation's chances of growing old. In a typical medieval village, life expectancy was shaped by rhythms that repeated year after year. Most families depended directly on the land. A good harvest meant full grain stores, bread that lasted through winter, and animals strong enough to breed and work. A poor harvest meant rationing, anxiety, and difficult choices about what to save and what to consume. When grain yields fell sharply, prices in nearby markets rose. For landless laborers and small tenants, that could be devastating. Malnutrition rarely appeared overnight. It crept in quietly, weakening immune systems and making common infections more dangerous. In this way, food supply was not just about hunger, it directly influenced how long people could expect to live. Housing conditions added another layer. Many rural homes were modest structures with limited ventilation. Smoke from indoor hearths lingered, irritating lungs over decades. Shared spaces with animals, common in some regions, increased exposure to parasites and zoonotic diseases. Water sources, often wells or streams, could become contaminated, particularly after flooding or heavy use. None of these factors guaranteed early death, but together they created an environment where illness could spread easily and recovery was uncertain. Life expectancy was shaped by these daily exposures as much as by dramatic events. In medieval towns and cities, the picture was both similar and different. Urban centers offered economic opportunity, trade networks, and specialized crafts. But density came at a cost. Narrow streets, closely packed buildings, and limited waste management created ideal conditions for infectious disease. Waste disposal systems varied widely in quality, and clean water was not always separated from runoff. Merchants, apprentices, and laborers lived in close quarters, which meant that when illness appeared, it could move quickly from household to household. Urban mortality rates were often higher than rural ones, especially for children. Some cities relied on a steady flow of migrants from the countryside simply to maintain their population numbers. Epidemics dramatically reshaped life expectancy calculations. The Black Death in the mid-14th century is the most famous example. When it arrived in Europe, it reduced populations on a scale that was unprecedented in recorded memory. In certain regions, a third or more of the population died within a few years. Life expectancy at birth during those outbreak years would have plummeted. But what is often overlooked is what happened afterward. With fewer people competing for land and wages, some survivors experienced improved living standards. Diets in certain areas improved, and wages rose for laborers. In the decades following major outbreaks, life expectancy for survivors could stabilize or even improve temporarily before the next epidemic wave disrupted society again. War also played a role, though its effects were uneven. Large-scale conflicts like the 100 Years' War disrupted agriculture, destroyed property, and displaced populations. Soldiers faced obvious risks, but civilians also suffered when armies requisitioned food or when farmland was abandoned. However, even in wartime, many communities continued their routines away from major battle zones. Medieval warfare did not envelop entire continents continuously. Its impact on life expectancy depended heavily on proximity and duration. Religious and charitable institutions influenced survival in subtle but important ways. Monasteries and hospitals provided food, shelter, and care to the sick and elderly. While medical knowledge was limited by modern standards, structured care, rest, warmth, basic hygiene, and nourishment could make a difference. Parish systems also reinforced communal responsibility. The expectation that neighbors would assist one another in times of hardship was not merely moral language. It was a survival strategy embedded in daily life. When we look at skeletal remains studied by modern researchers, we see evidence of both hardship and endurance. Signs of healed fractures suggest that injured individuals were cared for long enough to recover. Dental wear reveals lifelong diets of coarse grains. Joint degeneration speaks to years of physical labor. Yet the very presence of elderly skeletons confirms that many individuals reached advanced ages relative to their era. Medieval cemeteries do not consist solely of the young. They reflect a population where early mortality was high, but long adulthood was still achievable. Ultimately, life expectancy in the Middle Ages cannot be reduced to a single dramatic statistic. It was shaped by geography, class, gender, environment, and historical moment. The average may appear low, but averages conceal stories of resilience. For those who survived childhood and avoided catastrophic disease, life could extend well into later decades. Medieval people did not experience themselves as constantly on the brink of death. They planned for the future, raised families, built institutions, and invested in land and community. Their world was more precarious than ours in many ways, yet it was also structured, meaningful, and often surprisingly stable between crises. Understanding this balance between fragility and endurance is key to seeing medieval life expectancy clearly. It reminds us that statistics describe patterns, but lived experience unfolds year by year, season by season, shaped by countless small decisions and shared efforts to survive in a demanding world. Another important factor in medieval life expectancy was climate. The Middle Ages were not environmentally static. Periods such as the medieval warm period brought relatively favorable growing conditions to parts of Europe, allowing agricultural expansion into new lands. Longer growing seasons and milder temperatures could support larger populations. But this stability did not last indefinitely. By the 14th century, the onset of what historians often call the Little Ice Age introduced cooler, wetter, and more unpredictable weather patterns. Shorter growing seasons and excessive rainfall damaged crops and strained food supplies. One of the clearest examples of climate affecting life expectancy was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Years of relentless rain across much of northern Europe led to crop failures, livestock disease, and soaring food prices. Chroniclers describe hunger that stretched across regions, not just isolated villages. In such years, mortality rose sharply. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, but even healthy adults weakened by malnutrition were less able to resist illness. The famine did not permanently reduce life expectancy in every region, but it demonstrated how dependent medieval survival was on environmental stability. Sanitation and water management also shaped mortality patterns. While medieval towns are sometimes portrayed as uniformly filthy, the reality was more varied. Some cities invested in water conduits, wells, and rudimentary waste systems. Others relied on open drains and nearby rivers. Contaminated water could spread gastrointestinal disease, especially among children. In rural areas, access to cleaner streams sometimes reduced this risk, though livestock and flooding could still contaminate supplies. The absence of germ theory meant that prevention was inconsistent, even when people recognized that certain areas or smells were associated with sickness. Medical practice in the Middle Ages combined inherited classical knowledge, religious belief, and practical experience. Physicians trained in universities studied ancient texts, while local healers and midwives relied on herbal remedies and observation. Treatments ranged from dietary adjustments to bloodletting, poultices, and prayer. Some methods were ineffective or even harmful, but others, such as basic wound cleaning or quarantine during outbreaks, could improve survival. Importantly, care itself mattered. Being tended, kept warm, and nourished increased the chance of recovery from many illnesses. The limits of medieval medicine lowered overall life expectancy compared to modern standards, but it was not a world without healing traditions. Social inequality further divided outcomes. Nobility and wealthy merchants generally had access to better diets, safer housing, and professional medical care. They were not immune to epidemic disease, as plague made painfully clear, but their everyday mortality risks were often lower than those of laborers. Meanwhile, the poorest households faced cumulative disadvantages: insecure food access, physically punishing work, and limited capacity to recover from setbacks. Life expectancy statistics averaged these experiences together, masking the sharp contrasts between social groups. It is also important to recognize regional diversity beyond Western Europe. In parts of the Islamic world, advanced urban infrastructure and medical scholarship influenced survival patterns differently. In East Asia, strong state systems and agricultural innovations shaped demographic trends in distinct ways. The term Middle Ages covers centuries and continents, and life expectancy varied accordingly. No single number can represent such complexity. When we step back, what emerges is not a uniform picture of short lives abruptly ended, but a dynamic system where survival depended on layers of stability. Good harvests, relative peace, strong community ties, and functional local governance could support longer lives. Environmental stress, epidemic disease, and social breakdown could quickly reverse those gains. Medieval life expectancy rose and fell in response to these forces. For modern audiences, perhaps the most surprising realization is this: many medieval people expected to grow old. They made wills, transferred property, arranged marriages for grandchildren, and planned religious endowments intended to last beyond their lifetime. These actions suggest not a society resigned to universal early death, but one aware of risk and still oriented toward the future. Life was uncertain, but it was not lived without hope of longevity. In understanding life expectancy during the Middle Ages, we gain more than a statistic. We gain insight into how communities balanced fragility with resilience, how they adapted to hardship, and how, despite limited technology, many individuals navigated a demanding world and reached old age. If we narrow our focus to the household itself, we begin to see how daily habits quietly influenced life expectancy across generations. Medieval homes were places of production as much as shelter. Food was prepared from raw ingredients, often stored in ways that required careful management. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent mold. Meat and fish were salted, smoked, or dried. When preservation failed, spoiled food could lead to illness. Families developed practical knowledge about what was safe to eat and when supplies were turning dangerous. These small decisions, repeated daily, could determine whether a household stayed healthy through winter or succumbed to sickness. Clothing and warmth were equally important. In colder regions, insufficient protection against winter weather increased vulnerability to respiratory disease. Fuel shortages made it difficult to heat homes consistently. The elderly were particularly sensitive to prolonged cold, especially if already weakened by years of labor. Yet communities often recognized this vulnerability. Multi-generational households allowed older family members to remain integrated rather than isolated. Grandparents might contribute childcare or lighter domestic tasks while receiving support in return. This interdependence strengthened survival odds in subtle but meaningful ways. Marriage patterns also shaped demographic outcomes. In many parts of medieval Europe, people did not always marry extremely young. Economic conditions influenced the timing of marriage, especially among peasants who needed access to land or employment before forming a household. Later marriage could reduce the total number of pregnancies a woman experienced, which in turn lowered lifetime maternal risk. In contrast, earlier and more frequent childbirth increased cumulative danger. These variations affected female life expectancy differently across regions and centuries. Urban guild systems added another layer of social stability. Craft guilds regulated work, training, and mutual aid. Members could receive support in times of illness or hardship. Widows of guild members sometimes retained rights to continue a workshop or receive assistance. Such institutional structures did not eliminate poverty or early death, but they created buffers against sudden collapse. In this sense, social organization was directly tied to longevity. Mental and emotional life, though harder to measure, also mattered. Medieval religion provided frameworks for understanding suffering and death. Belief systems could not prevent disease, but they offered psychological stability. Rituals surrounding illness, burial, and remembrance reinforced community bonds. In times of epidemic, these shared practices helped people endure collective trauma. A stable social fabric, even in hardship, reduced abandonment and neglect, factors that could otherwise raise mortality. Archaeological evidence continues to refine our understanding of medieval longevity. Advances in bioarchaeology allow researchers to analyze bone chemistry, signs of malnutrition, and disease markers with increasing precision. Stable isotope analysis reveals diet composition. Dental enamel defects indicate episodes of childhood stress. These findings confirm written records. Childhood was the most dangerous phase of life, but those who survived it often lived decades longer. Skeletal populations show individuals in their 60s and beyond, reminding us that old age was not rare. As we compare medieval life expectancy to modern standards, the contrast is stark. Today, medical intervention, sanitation infrastructure, vaccination, and global food systems have transformed survival rates, especially in infancy. But the medieval experience highlights something fundamental about human history. Longevity has always been shaped by collective organization as much as by biology. Communities that managed food distribution, cared for the vulnerable, and adapted to environmental change created conditions where more people could grow old. In the end, life expectancy during the Middle Ages was not defined solely by hardship. It was defined by variability. Some years were stable and allowed families to thrive. Others brought famine or disease that altered entire generations. The average number may seem low to modern eyes, but behind it were countless individual lives, some tragically brief, others long and influential within their communities. By looking carefully at these patterns, we move beyond the stereotype of a uniformly short and brutal medieval existence. Instead, we see a world of risk balanced by resilience, where survival depended on land, labor, family, faith, and the fragile but persistent strength of human cooperation. As the later Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, gradual shifts began to influence life expectancy in subtle ways. Agricultural techniques improved in certain regions. Crop rotation systems became more refined, and new tools increased efficiency. While these changes did not eliminate famine, they reduced the frequency of catastrophic shortages in some areas. A slightly more reliable food supply meant stronger immune systems and a better chance of surviving seasonal illness. Over time, even modest nutritional improvements could extend average lifespans. Trade expansion also played a role. Growing commercial networks connected distant regions, allowing goods, including food, to move more widely than before. Cities that once depended solely on nearby harvests could sometimes import grain during local shortages. This did not guarantee stability, and trade disruptions could still be severe, but interconnected markets introduced new forms of resilience. At the same time, increased mobility meant diseases could travel faster along those same routes, reminding us that progress often carried mixed consequences. Public health responses slowly evolved as well. After repeated waves of plague, some cities began experimenting with quarantine measures. Ships arriving from infected regions were isolated. Travelers could be monitored. While medieval authorities did not understand bacteria, they recognized patterns of contagion. These early containment strategies sometimes reduced the scale of outbreaks. Over generations, Incremental learning contributed to modest gains in survival during epidemics. Demographic recovery after major crises also reveals how life expectancy was not static. Following the Black Death, population decline created labor shortages that shifted economic power in parts of Europe. Wages rose for surviving workers, and access to land improved for some peasants. Better living standards, even if temporary, influenced health outcomes. With improved diets and slightly reduced overcrowding, certain communities experienced periods where average adult longevity increased compared to pre-plague decades. However, recovery was uneven. In regions repeatedly struck by war or political instability, improvements were fragile. Conflict disrupted agriculture, displaced families, and spread disease. Life expectancy could rise in one generation and fall sharply in the next. This instability reinforces an important point. Medieval longevity was deeply sensitive to external shocks. Unlike the modern world, where large-scale infrastructure can buffer local crises, medieval societies had limited capacity to absorb sustained disruption. It is also worth considering how medieval people perceived aging itself. Without modern medicine, visible signs of aging often appeared earlier. Years of outdoor labor under harsh conditions could weather the body quickly. Yet aging was not solely associated with decline. Elders often held authority in family and village matters. Experience carried value, particularly in agricultural decision-making and conflict resolution. Reaching old age conferred social status in many communities, reinforcing the idea that longevity, when achieved, was respected. In comparing medieval life expectancy to today, the most dramatic difference lies in child survival. Modern healthcare has dramatically reduced infant and maternal mortality, raising average life expectancy at birth. Remove high childhood mortality from medieval statistics, and the gap between eras narrows, though it does not disappear. Adults still faced infectious diseases and lacked surgical or pharmaceutical interventions that are routine today. Even so, the medieval world was not devoid of long lives. It was a world where surviving the early years opened the possibility of decades more. Ultimately, understanding life expectancy in the Middle Ages requires patience with nuance. It demands that we separate averages from individual experience and recognize the powerful influence of environment, community, and historical timing. Medieval people lived in a world without modern medicine, yet they were not strangers to resilience or longevity. Many saw grandchildren grow, managed property in later years, and left legacies recorded in documents that survive to this day. Life in the Middle Ages was undeniably fragile by modern standards, but it was also structured, adaptive, and sustained by networks of care. The numbers alone can seem stark. The fuller story reveals something more balanced, a society where risk was ever present, yet where growing old remained a real and meaningful possibility for those who navigated the hazards of early life. When historians attempt to estimate medieval life expectancy, they rely on a combination of written records and physical evidence. Parish registers, tax lists, wills, monastic chronicles, and legal documents provide names and ages at death in some cases, though the data is often incomplete. Archaeology fills in other gaps. By examining burial grounds, Researchers can estimate age ranges based on bone development and wear. These methods are not perfect, but together they allow scholars to reconstruct demographic patterns with increasing confidence. What consistently emerges is a population shaped by high infant mortality, periodic crisis, and a significant number of adults who reached what we would recognize as later life. One useful way to understand medieval longevity is through the concept of conditional life expectancy. If a child survived to age 5, their statistical chances of reaching 40 or 50 improved dramatically. If they reached 20, their prospects improved further. This layered probability explains why medieval society could sustain complex institutions, universities, churches, trade networks, and governments. Such systems require experienced adults who live long enough to accumulate knowledge. The existence of medieval scholars writing into their 60s or rulers governing for decades reflects that conditional stability. Regional case studies highlight how varied these outcomes could be. In parts of England after the Black Death, improved access to land and food appears to have supported healthier adult populations for a time. In contrast, regions repeatedly affected by warfare or economic decline saw less consistent improvement. Mediterranean port cities, integrated into trade networks, faced recurring epidemic exposure. Northern rural communities sometimes enjoyed cleaner water and lower population density but remained vulnerable to crop failure. Life expectancy was never uniform across Europe, let alone across the wider medieval world. We should also consider how technology, even at a modest level, influenced survival. The heavy plow, water mills, and improved harness systems increased agricultural productivity in earlier centuries. Better crop yields supported larger populations and, in stable years, reduced the frequency of starvation. Architectural advances in certain towns improved water supply and waste removal. None of these developments eliminated mortality risk, but incremental progress mattered. Over centuries, small technological adaptations quietly shaped demographic trends. Another overlooked dimension is migration. Medieval populations were not immobile. Young adults often left rural villages for towns in search of opportunity. Some joined merchant ventures or military campaigns. Migration could expose individuals to new diseases and hazards, but it also redistributed population pressures. Urban mortality rates might be high, yet the steady flow of migrants indicates that cities offered economic advantages compelling enough to offset the risks. Life expectancy calculations in towns must therefore account for constant population turnover. Family memory and generational continuity provide an indirect measure of longevity. Property transfers frequently reference grandparents or extended kin. Legal disputes over inheritance sometimes involve individuals in their later years defending long-held rights. These glimpses show that old age, while not guaranteed, was embedded within the social structure. Medieval law codes even addressed the care of elderly parents, suggesting that aging was a recognized and common stage of life. When comparing medieval life expectancy to other historical eras, a broader pattern appears. For most of human history prior to modern medicine, average life expectancy at birth remained relatively low due to childhood mortality. The Middle Ages were not uniquely short-lived. They were typical of pre-industrial societies. What distinguishes them are the dramatic swings caused by epidemic disease, particularly plague, and the complex social responses that followed. In the end, life expectancy during the Middle Ages reflects a balance between vulnerability and adaptation. Nature, disease, and labor imposed constant pressures. Yet community organization, agricultural knowledge, technological improvement, and cultural resilience allowed many individuals to live into mature and even advanced age. The medieval world was not a place where 30 marked the inevitable end. It was a world where survival depended on surviving the earliest dangers, after which a long and purposeful life remained within reach. Understanding this reality helps modern audiences move beyond myth. It reveals a society neither uniformly doomed nor uniformly healthy, but one navigating uncertainty with the tools and knowledge available. And within that uncertainty, countless medieval men and women grew old, shaped families, and left their mark on history. If we widen the lens even further, medieval life expectancy also forces us to confront how differently people understood time, aging, and the rhythm of a human life. In a world without precise birth certificates for most of the population, age was often approximate. People marked life stages less by exact numbers and more by capability, childhood, youth, maturity, elderhood. This flexible understanding of age reflects a society where survival, rather than chronology, defined identity. Someone who had endured famine, illness, and decades of labor was visibly marked by experience, regardless of whether they knew their exact year of birth. Art and literature from the period quietly confirm the presence of older adults. Illuminated manuscripts depict gray-haired figures in advisory roles. Legal texts refer to ancient men and women whose testimony carried weight. Monastic communities recorded the deaths of elderly members who had spent 50 or 60 years in religious life. These references would make little sense in a society where almost no one survived past early adulthood. Instead, they suggest a demographic structure where elders, though fewer in proportion than today, were nonetheless familiar and socially significant. The rural manor system also sheds light on longevity. Manorial court rolls sometimes list tenants across multiple decades, tracking fines, land transfers, and disputes. In some cases, the same individual appears in records 20 or 30 years apart. This continuity indicates stable adult survival once early life hazards were passed. Similarly, wills written in later medieval centuries frequently contain provisions for grandchildren, apprentices, and charitable donations, decisions that imply long-term planning rather than an expectation of imminent early death. Even so, the unpredictability of crisis remained a defining feature. The arrival of plague could erase decades of demographic stability in a matter of months. Chroniclers described the shock of watching neighbors fall ill in rapid succession. Yet, after each wave, communities rebuilt. Birth rates rose, marriages resumed, and economic life reorganized itself. This pattern of collapse and recovery is central to understanding medieval life expectancy. It was not a steady upward or downward line, but a series of fluctuations shaped by forces largely beyond individual control. Another important dimension is the relationship between population size and resources. In periods of population growth, land fragmentation and competition for work could lower living standards, indirectly reducing adult longevity. After major mortality crises, surviving populations sometimes enjoyed better wages and more available land, temporarily improving diet and health. In this sense, life expectancy was tied to broader demographic cycles. Medieval societies were constantly adjusting to the balance between people and resources. When modern audiences imagine medieval life, it is often through extremes, either romanticized endurance or relentless brutality. The truth lies between. Daily life involved hard labor and genuine risk, but it also involved routine, celebration, family bonds, and shared traditions. Seasonal festivals, marriages, market days, and religious observances structured the year. These rhythms created continuity across generations. The existence of tradition itself implies that enough people lived long enough to transmit memory, skill, and belief. Perhaps the most revealing comparison is this. In many medieval communities, if you survive to age 20, you might reasonably expect to live another 25 or 30 years, barring epidemic or war. That expectation, though fragile, was real. It allowed societies to invest in long apprenticeships, multi-year construction projects like cathedrals, and agricultural systems that required careful long-term stewardship. None of this would be possible if adulthood were consistently brief. In reflecting on life expectancy during the Middle Ages, we see a human story that is both distant and familiar. Infant mortality was tragically high. Medical knowledge was limited. Environmental shocks could be devastating. Yet resilience, adaptation, and communal care created space for long lives within those constraints. Medieval people navigated uncertainty not with modern science, but with cooperation, practical knowledge, and social structure. The average figures may initially appear stark, but they conceal a layered reality. Beneath the statistics were individuals who grew old enough to advise, to remember, and to pass on their experience. Life in the Middle Ages was precarious, yet it was not uniformly short. It was a world where survival required endurance, and where, for many who endured, old age was not the exception, but a hard-earned stage of life. In the final analysis, life expectancy during the Middle Ages tells us as much about structure as it does about survival. Medieval societies operated without the medical frameworks we take for granted, yet they were not chaotic or unaware of risk. Communities understood patterns. They recognized that certain seasons brought illness, that famine followed failed harvests, that overcrowding worsened outbreaks. Their responses, whether through food storage, charity, quarantine, or migration, were attempts to manage probability in a world governed largely by uncertainty. One of the clearest long-term patterns is gradual improvement punctuated by crisis. In the centuries after the worst waves of plague, parts of Europe saw incremental gains in nutrition and stability. Agricultural diversification reduced dependence on a single crop. Livestock management improved. Some towns invested more deliberately in water systems and street regulation. These measures did not revolutionize life expectancy overnight, but they nudged it upward in subtle ways. Progress in the medieval world was slow, uneven, and easily reversed, yet it was not absent. At the same time, the limits of pre-modern medicine placed a ceiling on longevity. Infections that are minor inconveniences today could become fatal. Minor injuries could turn septic. Childbirth remained dangerous well into the early modern era. Without vaccination, populations remained vulnerable to recurring epidemic disease. These biological realities ensured that average life expectancy would remain far below modern standards. But again, averages obscure distribution. The presence of individuals living into their 60s and 70s is well documented. Longevity existed, though it was statistically less common. It is also important to remember that medieval people themselves did not calculate life expectancy. They did not experience their lives as a number. They experienced them through stages: learning a trade, forming a household, raising children, serving in parish or guild, and eventually stepping into elder roles. Survival was measured not in averages but in milestones. A child's first years passed safely, a harvest brought in successfully, a marriage arranged, a grandchild baptized. Each milestone represented continuity in a world where continuity was never guaranteed. When historians reconstruct demographic patterns, they often emphasize infant mortality because of its statistical weight. In many medieval communities, perhaps a quarter to a third of children died before reaching adulthood, sometimes more during crisis years. This single factor dramatically lowers average life expectancy at birth. Remove that early mortality, and the picture changes significantly. Adults who navigated childhood hazards often lived long enough to shape their communities in lasting ways. Comparing the Middle Ages to other pre-industrial societies reveals striking similarities. Across much of the ancient and early modern world, life expectancy hovered at comparable levels, largely for the same reasons: vulnerability in infancy, periodic famine, endemic disease, and limited medical intervention. The medieval period was not uniquely harsh. It was representative of a broader human condition prior to industrialization and modern public health. Perhaps the most meaningful conclusion is this: medieval life expectancy reflects a society in negotiation with its environment. Climate shifts, soil fertility, trade networks, and disease ecology all played decisive roles. Yet human agency mattered too. Cooperation, adaptation, and incremental learning improved survival odds across generations. Medieval communities were not passive victims of circumstance. They observed, adjusted, and rebuilt after catastrophe. For modern viewers, understanding medieval longevity encourages perspective. The dramatic rise in life expectancy over the past 2 centuries is extraordinary in historical terms. It rests on sanitation, medical science, agricultural innovation, and global infrastructure, developments that slowly built upon the foundations laid by earlier societies. The Middle Ages stand not as an era of inevitable early death, but as a chapter in a much longer story of gradual improvement interrupted by profound challenges. When we look beyond the simplified statistic and examine the full demographic landscape, a more balanced image emerges. The Middle Ages were marked by real fragility, especially in early childhood. Yet they were also marked by endurance. Many individuals survived into mature and even advanced age, contributing to families, economies, and institutions that shaped the future. Life expectancy during this period was lower than today, but it was not defined solely by brevity. It was defined by variability, by risk and resilience existing side by side. And in that balance, we find something recognizably human. The persistent effort to build stable lives in an unpredictable world, and the quiet hope that, despite uncertainty, there would be time enough to grow old. If we bring all of these threads together, what ultimately defined life expectancy during the Middle Ages was not a single constant hardship, but exposure to layered risk. A medieval person's lifespan was shaped by a chain of vulnerabilities that began at birth. Survive infancy, and the statistical horizon widened. Reach adolescence, and the odds improved again. Establish adulthood, and the possibility of decades more life became realistic, though never guaranteed. The fragility was real, but it was concentrated in specific stages and moments rather than evenly distributed across every year of existence. One of the most revealing insights from demographic history is how powerfully early mortality skews perception. If, in a hypothetical village, many children die before age 5, the average age at death drops sharply, even if a substantial number of adults live into their 50s and 60s. Medieval life expectancy at birth might appear to hover around 30 years in some regions and centuries. But this does not mean medieval society was composed mostly of 30-year-olds dying of old age. It means childhood was the most dangerous frontier. Once crossed, survival became more common than popular imagination suggests. The experience of aging itself also differed from the modern world. Without advanced dentistry, eyeglasses widely available, or surgical intervention, the body's wear accumulated visibly. Chronic joint pain from agricultural labor, untreated dental infections, and limited pain relief could make a 50-year-old appear older by modern standards. Yet functionality mattered more than appearance. As long as an individual could contribute, through labor, supervision, memory, or skill, they retained social value. Elderly villagers might no longer plow fields, but they could oversee livestock, mend tools, or care for young children. Longevity was integrated into communal life rather than isolated from it. It is also important to consider psychological resilience. Medieval societies lived with mortality in ways that feel distant today. Death was visible, communal, and ritualized. Burial practices, memorial masses, and collective mourning were structured responses to loss. This did not make grief lighter, but it provided cultural frameworks for processing it. In a world where infant death was common, families developed emotional strategies to continue forward. The normalization of mortality may have strengthened communal bonds, reinforcing systems of mutual support that indirectly improved survival for those who remained. Urbanization toward the later medieval centuries introduced both new dangers and new stabilizing forces. Cities concentrated disease, yet they also concentrated knowledge. Universities trained physicians. Administrative systems recorded births, deaths, and property transfers with increasing sophistication. Municipal authorities experimented with health regulations during outbreaks. While their understanding of disease transmission was incomplete, the very act of coordinated response marked a shift toward structured public health. These early measures foreshadowed later transformations that would eventually revolutionize life expectancy centuries afterward. Another dimension often overlooked is regional climate adaptation. Communities in harsher northern climates developed architectural and agricultural strategies suited to shorter growing seasons. Mediterranean regions adapted to heat and water scarcity differently. Over generations, these localized adaptations stabilized survival within specific ecological niches. Life expectancy, therefore, cannot be detached from geography. A coastal trading city, a mountain village, and a fertile river valley each produced different mortality patterns. When examining skeletal remains, historians frequently find evidence of healed injuries. Broken bones that mended, teeth that wore down over decades, and joints that deteriorated gradually all point to sustained survival after trauma. This evidence challenges the notion of constant, immediate fatality. Medieval medicine may not have been advanced, but caregiving and the body's natural capacity to heal allowed many individuals to recover from setbacks that might otherwise have shortened their lives. Ultimately, medieval life expectancy reflects a world balancing on the edge of modernity but still rooted in pre-industrial vulnerability. The dramatic increases in average lifespan over the past 200 years were built upon transformations in sanitation, nutrition, vaccination, and scientific medicine. The Middle Ages existed before those breakthroughs, yet they were not defined solely by early death. They were defined by cycles of hardship and recovery, of scarcity and abundance, of epidemic and rebuilding. For modern audiences, perhaps the most meaningful takeaway is perspective. The Middle Ages were not a time when everyone died young, nor were they an era of comfortable longevity. They were a time when life expectancy was conditional, shaped by environment and community as much as by biology. Many children never reached adulthood. Many adults did. Some lived long enough to witness sweeping historical change. Wars, plagues, economic shifts, and still die in what their communities recognized as old age. Behind every statistical average was a lived story. A farmer who endured harsh winters for 50 years, a craftswoman who raised children and grandchildren, a monk who copied manuscripts into his 60s, a merchant who rebuilt after plague and continued trading. Life in the Middle Ages demanded resilience. As we draw this exploration to a close, it becomes clear that life expectancy in the Middle Ages is best understood not as a single figure, but as a reflection of how a society functioned under pressure. Every medieval community existed within a delicate balance of land, labor, climate, and disease. When that balance held, life could feel stable for years at a time. When it failed, mortality rose swiftly and visibly. The rhythm of medieval longevity was therefore cyclical rather than linear, periods of endurance interrupted by sudden vulnerability. One of the most striking contrasts with the modern world is predictability. Today, in much of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, life expectancy is shaped by chronic conditions and long-term lifestyle factors. In the medieval world, the greatest threats were often acute and external. A failed harvest, an unfamiliar illness arriving by ship, or an unusually harsh winter could change survival prospects across an entire region in a single year. This unpredictability shaped how people viewed time. Planning for the future was essential, but so was preparing for abrupt disruption. Yet even within this uncertainty, medieval societies demonstrated remarkable continuity. Cathedrals were built over generations, requiring confidence that communities would endure long enough to see foundations become towers. Agricultural systems demanded careful stewardship of land that would outlast any one farmer. Apprenticeships in craft trades lasted years, sometimes a decade or more, investing in skills with the expectation of long adult working lives. These commitments suggest that, despite the risks, people anticipated time to grow, to work, to age. It is also worth emphasizing that medieval demographic patterns were not static across the entire thousand-year span, often labeled the Middle Ages. Early medieval Europe, shaped by post-Roman transition, experienced different conditions than the high medieval centuries of population growth and urban expansion. The 14th century introduced catastrophic plague mortality, while later centuries saw gradual adaptation and demographic recovery. Life expectancy shifted in response to these broad structural changes. No single century defines the whole era. The presence of older adults in medieval records carries symbolic weight as well. Elders often served as witnesses in legal disputes because memory mattered in a largely oral culture. Long-lived individuals preserved knowledge of land boundaries, family lineages, and customary rights. In this sense, longevity had social power. It reinforced continuity and stability. The survival of elders was not only a biological outcome but a cultural asset. When we examine medieval cemeteries, parish lists, and narrative chronicles together, we see a layered demographic reality. Infant graves are numerous, reminding us of early vulnerability. Adult burials span a wide range of ages, many consistent with midlife and beyond. Occasional references to individuals described as very old or advanced in years confirm that exceptional longevity was recognized and remembered. These glimpses prevent us from oversimplifying the medieval lifespan into a uniformly short arc. The modern tendency to summarize the Middle Ages with a low average life expectancy often reflects our reliance on statistics without context. But numbers alone cannot capture lived experience. A medieval villager did not calculate averages. They measured life through seasons survived, children raised, debts paid, and fields harvested. Survival was practical, immediate, and communal. When epidemics came, they were devastating. When stability returned, it could last long enough for families to rebuild and age together. In many ways, medieval life expectancy reveals a society resilient within constraint. Without antibiotics, vaccination, or advanced surgery, survival depended heavily on nutrition, sanitation, and collective care. These were imperfect tools, yet they sustained millions of lives across centuries. The dramatic rise in life expectancy in the modern era stands out precisely because for so long human survival followed patterns much like those of the Middle Ages, fragile in youth, uncertain in crisis, but capable of extending into old age under favorable conditions. So when we ask what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the most honest answer is layered. At birth, it was low by modern standards, largely because childhood was perilous. After surviving the early years, prospects improved significantly. Many adults lived into their 50s or 60s. Some lived longer still. Life was neither uniformly short nor reliably long. It was contingent, and perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Medieval life expectancy reminds us that longevity is not simply a biological fact. It is a social achievement. It emerges from food systems, climate stability, communal responsibility, and shared knowledge. The people of the Middle Ages lived without the scientific advantages we now possess, yet they navigated risk with adaptability and cooperation. In doing so, many secured not just survival but time to work, to teach, to remember, and ultimately to grow old in a world that was as uncertain as it was enduring. If we take one final step back, life expectancy in the Middle Ages ultimately tells a story about thresholds. There was the threshold of birth, where survival was most uncertain. There was the threshold of early childhood, when a fragile body either strengthened or succumbed to disease. There was the threshold of adulthood, when labor, marriage, and parenthood began to define one's place in the community. And finally, there was the threshold of old age, reached by fewer than today, but by far more than popular imagination often assumes. Crossing each threshold changed the statistical landscape of a medieval life. A newborn faced the highest danger. A 10-year-old had already survived the most perilous years. A 20-year-old who had avoided epidemic disease and severe malnutrition might reasonably expect decades ahead, provided wider crises did not intervene. This layered structure explains why medieval society could sustain generational continuity. It was not a civilization constantly collapsing into premature death. It was a civilization where risk was front-loaded and crisis-driven. The environment remained a silent partner in every lifespan. Medieval communities lacked the technological insulation that modern societies rely on. A run of cold summers could shorten growing seasons and weaken entire populations. Excessive rain could rot crops in the field. Drought could parch southern regions. These environmental shifts directly translated into nutritional stress, and nutritional stress directly influenced mortality. Yet communities responded with adaptation, diversifying crops, adjusting planting cycles, relying on trade when possible. Human agency did not eliminate environmental risk, but it mitigated it. Economic structure mattered just as deeply. In feudal and manorial systems, obligations tied peasants to land, but they also created predictable patterns of work and resource distribution. Lords depended on peasant survival. Labor shortages reduced agricultural output. This interdependence encouraged a basic level of stability, even if inequality remained stark. After major mortality events such as the Black Death, the sudden scarcity of labor shifted economic leverage toward workers in some regions, improving wages and diet. For a generation or two, these shifts could support longer adult survival. Religion, too, played a stabilizing role beyond belief alone. Monasteries and parishes organized charity, maintained hospitals, and recorded demographic information. In times of epidemic, clergy often provided care at personal risk. The institutional continuity of the Church, stretching across centuries, offered a framework for community resilience. While faith could not prevent disease, it structured response and mutual obligation in ways that indirectly affected survival. When we compare medieval life expectancy to that of earlier antiquity, we see broad similarities. Both eras struggled with high childhood mortality and periodic epidemic shock. What distinguishes the later Middle Ages is the scale of plague mortality in the 14th century and the subsequent economic recalibration. In some regions, post-plague improvements in diet and living conditions created modest but real gains in adult longevity. These gains were fragile, yet they demonstrate that medieval demographic systems were capable of adaptation. It is also crucial to recognize the diversity beyond Europe. In the Islamic world, advanced medical scholarship and urban infrastructure influenced survival patterns differently. In parts of East Asia, sophisticated agricultural systems and centralized governance shaped demographic stability in unique ways. The Middle Ages encompass varied civilizations, climates, and social structures. Any single life expectancy figure is therefore an oversimplification of a complex global tapestry. Perhaps the clearest takeaway is that medieval life was neither relentlessly brief nor comfortably long. It was conditional. Survive infancy, avoid famine, endure epidemic, and a person could live long enough to see grandchildren. Fail at any of those points, and life could end abruptly. This conditional structure created a culture deeply aware of mortality but equally invested in continuity. Families saved, built, planned, and remembered. They acted not as though life were guaranteed, but as though it were worth sustaining. For modern audiences accustomed to steady increases in lifespan, the medieval pattern can feel stark. Yet it also highlights how extraordinary recent medical and public health advances truly are. The sharp rise in average life expectancy over the past 2 centuries represents a historical break from thousands of years of relatively stable demographic patterns. The Middle Ages stand as part of that longer human story, a chapter defined by resilience within constraint. In the end, life expectancy during the Middle Ages reflects a world negotiating its limits. Technology was modest, medicine incomplete, and environmental control minimal. Yet within those limits, human communities created systems of support strong enough to carry many individuals into mature and sometimes advanced age. The numbers may appear low when viewed from the present, but behind them were lives fully lived, lives shaped by hardship, certainly, but also by endurance, cooperation, and the quiet persistence of hope that there would be time enough to grow old. To truly appreciate what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, it helps to imagine standing in a medieval village at the turn of a new year. Snow lies on the fields, food stores are being carefully rationed, and families are taking quiet stock of who made it through the winter. Survival is counted not in statistics, but in faces still present at the table. The elderly neighbor who remembers a famine decades earlier. The child who overcame a fever in autumn. The mother who survived childbirth. Each represents a victory over probabilities that were never entirely in anyone's control. This intimate, household-level awareness of risk shaped medieval attitudes toward time. Life was not assumed to be long, but neither was it assumed to be short. It was uncertain. That uncertainty produced a culture that valued preparation, storing grain, maintaining tools, strengthening kinship ties. The extended family was not merely sentimental. It was practical. Grandparents contributed labor and knowledge. Adult children supported aging parents. The household functioned as an economic and survival unit, increasing the likelihood that its members would cross the fragile thresholds of youth and illness. The medieval economy reinforced this interdependence. In agrarian regions, most wealth was tied to land and livestock. A family's survival depended on collective effort. When one member fell ill, others absorbed the workload if possible. This flexibility did not eliminate mortality, but it reduced abandonment and isolation, factors that can sharply raise death rates in unstable societies. The presence of cooperative labor networks, whether through kinship or village custom, quietly extended lives. Yet unpredictability remained the defining force. Consider a merchant family in a port city. For years, trade flows steadily. Food arrives by ship, craftsmen work, and urban life hums with relative stability. Then rumors of disease spread along the same trade routes that once carried prosperity. Within weeks, the city's demographic profile can shift dramatically. Life expectancy during those outbreak years collapses. And yet, after the epidemic recedes, survivors reorganize commerce, repair infrastructure, and continue forward. This rhythm of disruption and recovery repeats across centuries. It is also worth noting that medieval people developed cultural tools to cope with repeated exposure to mortality. Art, sermons, and literature frequently reminded audiences of life's fragility. This was not morbid fascination, but acknowledgement of reality. By integrating mortality into religious and social life, communities normalized grief without surrendering to despair. Such psychological frameworks may not directly change biological survival, but they influence social stability, and social stability affects health outcomes. When modern historians model medieval demography, they often describe it as a high-pressure system. Population growth pressed against the limits of agricultural productivity. Environmental stress could tip that system into crisis. But pressure also generated innovation. Improved plows, crop rotation, water management, and urban organization all emerged from the need to sustain growing populations. Over long stretches, these incremental improvements nudged survival rates upward, even if gains were periodically erased by plague or famine. Importantly, medieval life expectancy was not static across class lines. A noble household with access to diverse foods, spacious living quarters, and private medical care faced different daily risks than a landless laborer. Still, wealth did not confer immunity. Epidemic disease disregarded status more readily than hunger did. Some of the most detailed mortality records from plague years show high death rates among clergy and elites who remained in affected cities. Social hierarchy shaped survival, but it did not fully determine it. As the Middle Ages progressed into the 15th century and beyond, demographic recovery became more consistent in many regions. Repeated exposure to plague may have produced limited population-level resistance, though historians continue to debate the extent. What is clear is that societies adapted institutionally. Quarantine laws became more formalized. Record-keeping improved. Trade regulation and urban governance evolved. These measures did not eliminate mortality shocks, but they gradually strengthened resilience. For viewers today, accustomed to stable life expectancy projections and advanced healthcare systems, the medieval pattern can feel alien. But it also reveals something enduring about the human condition. For most of history, life expectancy was shaped less by chronic diseases of aging and more by acute threats in youth and crisis years. Survive those threats, and life could unfold across decades in familiar ways: work, family, faith, aging. In the final measure, life expectancy during the Middle Ages was neither uniformly bleak nor comfortably secure. It was conditional and cyclical, shaped by forces both natural and social. Behind the averages were countless individuals who endured harsh winters, recovered from illness, raised children, and gradually stepped into elderhood. Their lives were shorter on average than ours, yes, but they were not defined solely by brevity. They were defined by resilience within limitation. And in that resilience, we recognize something timeless: the persistent human effort to carve out stability, meaning, and longevity in a world that has never fully guaranteed any of those things. If we imagine following a single medieval community across several generations, the patterns of life expectancy become even clearer. In the first generation, a cluster of children are born in the same year. A few will not survive infancy. A few more may fall to illness before adolescence. By the time that group reaches adulthood, it is smaller but still substantial. Those who remain marry, inherit land or tools, and begin households of their own. Their lives unfold not in constant crisis, but in cycles of planting and harvest, of births and burials, of local disputes and shared celebrations. Then, perhaps 20 years later, an epidemic passes through. It strikes unevenly. Some households are devastated. Others lose no one. The demographic balance shifts abruptly. Fields are left temporarily untended. Property changes hands. Yet within a few seasons, work resumes. Children are born again. Apprentices take the place of lost craftsmen. Over time, the community stabilizes. The second generation grows up in the shadow of remembered loss, but with improved access to land or wages because the population is smaller. In this way, mortality and recovery are intertwined. This generational lens helps us understand why medieval life expectancy cannot be described simply as short. It was volatile. A person born in a relatively stable decade might live a long and productive life. Someone born just before a famine or plague wave might not. The difference often came down to timing as much as biology. Unlike modern societies, where public health systems smooth out many fluctuations, medieval communities were exposed directly to environmental and epidemiological cycles. Even so, continuity was powerful. Medieval institutions, legal systems, guilds, monasteries, and universities persisted for centuries. Such endurance required adults who lived long enough to transmit expertise and authority. A master craftsman might train apprentices over decades. A landholder might oversee the same estate for 40 years. A monk might copy manuscripts into old age. These long arcs of individual contribution are embedded in the historical record. Another important consideration is how medieval demography influenced family size. High infant mortality often encouraged families to have more children. understanding that not all would survive. This pattern created large sibling groups, which in turn strengthened labor capacity and mutual support. Surviving siblings cared for aging parents and supported one another during hardship. The family acted as a buffer against mortality shocks. While the loss of children was tragically common, the broader kin network provided continuity. As we approach the later medieval centuries, subtle improvements in infrastructure begin to appear in certain regions. Some towns paved streets to reduce standing water. Others regulated butchers, tanners, and waste disposal more strictly. These measures were inconsistent and imperfect, yet they reflect a growing awareness that environment influenced health. Over time, incremental regulation contributed to modest gains in urban survival rates. Still, it is essential not to project modern expectations backward. Medieval life expectancy remained fundamentally constrained by the absence of advanced medical intervention. A severe infection, a complicated childbirth, or a contagious outbreak could override all social stability. This reality infused medieval culture with a sober awareness of life's limits. Wills were often written earlier in adulthood than they are today. Religious preparation for death was a normal part of life, not an exceptional act. And yet, despite that awareness, medieval people invested deeply in the future. They planted orchards whose fruit they might never taste. They contributed labor to cathedrals that would rise long after they were gone. They saved for dowries and apprenticeships. These long-term commitments reveal confidence that life, though uncertain, was often long enough to justify planning. For modern viewers, perhaps the most balanced conclusion is this: life expectancy during the Middle Ages was shaped by concentrated early risk and periodic collective crisis. Remove those peaks of vulnerability, and many medieval adults experience spans of life that feel surprisingly familiar. They worked into middle age, adjusted to the physical realities of aging, and relied on family networks in later years. The Middle Ages were not an era where old age was unheard of, nor were they a time of widespread longevity by contemporary standards. They occupied a middle ground common to much of pre-modern history, where life was fragile at its beginning, resilient in its middle, and uncertain at every turn. And within that uncertainty, generation after generation endured, adapted, and, more often than we might expect, grew old enough to tell the story. As we reach the end of this deep dive, it helps to return to the central misunderstanding that often surrounds life expectancy in the Middle Ages. When modern readers encounter a figure such as 30 or 35 years as an average life expectancy at birth, it can create an image of a world where few people ever saw their 40th birthday. But that image collapses under closer examination. The average is not the lived experience. It is a statistical reflection of intense early vulnerability combined with periodic catastrophe. In reality, medieval societies were structured around the expectation that many individuals would live well beyond youth. Laws concerning inheritance assumed adulthood and often middle age. Guild hierarchies required years of apprenticeship followed by long careers as masters. Clerical advancement in the church depended on decades of service. These frameworks would have been impossible in a world where most people died in their 30s. The documentary record, when read carefully, consistently points to a population where childhood was the most dangerous stage, not adulthood itself. This does not mean medieval life was easy or gentle. Physical labor was relentless. Illness was common. Pain management was limited. Aging bodies bore the marks of work in ways that feel stark to us today. But hardship does not equal brevity. A farmer might endure chronic joint pain for 20 years. A craftswoman might lose several children in infancy and still live to see grandchildren. These layered experiences remind us that longevity and suffering were not mutually exclusive. The Middle Ages also reveal how closely human survival was tied to environmental balance. A sequence of stable harvests could support a generation of relatively healthy adults. A cluster of failed harvests could reverse that stability quickly. The same land that sustained life could, under shifting climate patterns, undermine it. Modern infrastructure and global trade networks buffer much of this volatility. Medieval communities faced it directly. Their life expectancy rose and fell with the rhythm of nature. Epidemics remain the most dramatic illustration of this vulnerability. The Black Death and subsequent plague waves reshaped entire populations. In outbreak years, life expectancy calculations plummeted to extraordinary lows. Yet these were spikes in mortality, not permanent baselines. Between major outbreaks, communities recovered. Birth rates increased. Economic adjustments improved wages in some regions. Over time, the demographic structure rebalanced. The Middle Ages were marked by disruption, but also by remarkable regenerative capacity. It is also essential to recognize the cultural dimension of aging. In many medieval communities, old age carried authority. Elders were custodians of memory in societies where written documentation, while present, was not universally accessible. Long-lived individuals provided continuity in land agreements, family histories, and customary law. Their survival was socially valuable. This cultural respect for age further reinforces the fact that old age, while not guaranteed, was visible and meaningful. Comparing medieval life expectancy to today ultimately highlights the scale of modern transformation. The dramatic increase in survival rates since the 19th century is historically exceptional. Vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, improved obstetric care, and nutritional security have fundamentally altered the human lifespan. For thousands of years prior, including the Middle Ages, demographic patterns followed similar contours. High infant mortality, episodic epidemic shock, and conditional adult longevity. Perhaps the most balanced way to summarize medieval life expectancy is this: life was front-loaded with risk and periodically interrupted by crisis, but it was not inherently short for those who survived early danger. Many medieval adults experienced decades of productive life. They worked, governed, worshipped, raised families, and aged within recognizable social structures. Their lives were constrained by limited medicine and environmental uncertainty, yet they were sustained by community, adaptation, and shared obligation. In the end, the Middle Ages were not an era defined solely by early death. They were defined by resilience in the face of instability. Behind every low average life expectancy figure were individuals who navigated childhood hazards, endured epidemics, and reached elderhood. Their longevity may not have matched modern standards, but it was real, and it shaped the course of history just as surely as any king, battle, or empire. And that is the fuller picture. A world where survival was never guaranteed, but where time, hard-earned and uncertain, was often long enough to build families, institutions, and legacies that would endure far beyond a single lifetime. Before we close completely, it is worth reflecting on how the question of medieval life expectancy changes the way we see the entire era. When we strip away the myth that everyone died at 30, the Middle Ages become less alien and more recognizably human. They are no longer a blur of constant early death, but a complex demographic landscape shaped by probability, resilience, and adaptation. Imagine again a medieval parish over the course of 50 years. Children are baptized, some buried young, others growing into adulthood. Couples marry in their 20s. Fields are worked year after year. A plague passes through and alters the balance. Survivors inherit land or responsibility sooner than expected. 2 decades later, some of those same survivors are gray-haired, advising younger neighbors who barely remember the outbreak. This is not a society without aging. It is a society aging unevenly, unpredictably, but undeniably. Medieval chroniclers occasionally remark on individuals who lived to what they considered advanced years. A monk dying in his 70s might be noted for remarkable longevity. A noblewoman managing estates into later life could be described as venerable. These references are not statistical anomalies. They are reminders that biological potential for long life has existed for centuries. What differed were the external pressures limiting how many people reached that potential. One of the most powerful constraints was maternal mortality. Each pregnancy carried real risk. In communities where women bore multiple children, the cumulative danger increased. Some women died young in childbirth, lowering average adult life expectancy for females. Yet many survived repeated pregnancies and continued to live for decades afterward. Surviving motherhood often meant entering middle age with established authority within the household. Widows, in particular, could wield economic and social influence, sometimes managing property independently for years. Childhood, again, remains central. Modern improvements in vaccination, sanitation, and neonatal care have dramatically reduced mortality in the earliest years of life. Remove those advances and average life expectancy drops quickly, even if adult survival remains stable. That was the medieval reality. High infant mortality drove averages downward, but those who survived early disease often moved into adulthood with a reasonable expectation of living well beyond 30. There is also a broader philosophical dimension. Medieval societies were organized around continuity rather than longevity alone. Lineage, land, and faith extended beyond individual lifespans. A person's life was meaningful not only for its length, but for its place within a generational chain. This perspective softened, though never eliminated, the emotional shock of mortality. Even when life expectancy was statistically lower than today, the cultural emphasis on succession and inheritance created stability across time. Archaeological studies reinforce this layered understanding. Cemetery age distributions consistently show a mix: many young graves, but also a steady presence of mature and older adults. Skeletal evidence of degenerative joint disease, healed fractures, and long-term where confirms sustained survival after injury and illness. Medieval bodies bore hardship, but they also endured it. When we compare life expectancy across different medieval regions, we see that no single number captures the experience. A well-fed rural valley during stable decades might produce longer adult lives than a crowded trade hub facing repeated outbreaks. Climate, diet, warfare, and governance all mattered. The Middle Ages spanned nearly 1,000 years in Europe alone, and demographic conditions in the 9th century were not identical to those in the 15th. Change was gradual, uneven, and often local. Ultimately, the story of medieval life expectancy is a story about thresholds and recovery. High early mortality narrowed the base of each generation. Epidemics carved sudden gaps. Yet time and again, communities rebuilt, repopulate, and restored balance. Within that cycle, many individuals lived long enough to become elders, to accumulate experience, and to shape the world around them. So when we ask what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the most honest answer resists extremes. It was lower than today, shaped by childhood vulnerability and periodic catastrophe. But it was not a world devoid of old age. It was a world where longevity was possible, though never guaranteed, where survival depended on environment, community, and timing. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. Medieval people lived with uncertainty more openly than we do. Yet they still planned, built, loved, and aged. Their lives were not defined solely by how long they lasted, but by how they were sustained, together across generations. If we sit quietly with the full picture, life expectancy in the Middle Ages becomes less about a number and more about a pattern of living within limits. Medieval men and women did not wake each morning calculating statistical averages. They woke to weather, to work, to family responsibilities. Their understanding of longevity came not from demographic charts, but from observation. They knew which winters had been especially harsh. They remembered years when illness moved from house to house. They noticed which families seemed consistently fortunate and which were repeatedly struck by misfortune. Experience, rather than abstraction, shaped their sense of how long a life might be. That lived awareness created a culture deeply attuned to risk. Grain was stored carefully because one failed harvest could ripple outward for months. Livestock were guarded because animals represented food security. Marriages were often arranged with economic stability in mind, strengthening alliances that could protect households during difficult periods. These strategies were not merely social customs. They were mechanisms that increased the likelihood of crossing life's vulnerable thresholds. In examining medieval wills, historians often find individuals in midlife making detailed provisions for property distribution. This habit reflects two truths at once. First, death was unpredictable enough to warrant preparation. Second, individuals had accumulated enough wealth and expectation of continued life to make such preparation meaningful. A will implies continuity, possessions to pass on, heirs to receive them, institutions to remember the deceased. It suggests a society structured around generational succession rather than abrupt extinction. We must also consider how physical endurance shaped perceptions of age. Without modern medicine, chronic conditions such as arthritis, dental disease, or untreated infections could reduce mobility or comfort long before death. A 50-year-old agricultural laborer might appear physically older than a modern office worker of the same age. Yet diminished physical strength did not necessarily signal imminent death. Many elderly individuals adjusted roles within the household, contributing in ways suited to their capacity. Longevity was measured not only by vitality, but by continued belonging. Even warfare, often associated with medieval instability, did not universally depress life expectancy across entire populations. While campaigns and sieges were devastating locally, large portions of rural life could proceed with relative normality during peacetime intervals. Medieval Europe was not in a constant state of total war. Demographic fluctuations from conflict were real but uneven, layered atop the more persistent patterns of disease and nutrition. Over centuries, small improvements accumulated. Agricultural innovation modestly increased yields. Trade connected distant food sources. Urban regulations began addressing sanitation. Quarantine practices during plague outbreaks became more systematic in certain regions. None of these developments transformed medieval life expectancy into modern levels, but they demonstrate incremental adaptation. Human societies learned, slowly and imperfectly, from repeated crises. Perhaps the most profound difference between medieval and modern life expectancy lies in the concentration of mortality in early childhood. Today, the vast majority of children in developed nations survive infancy. In the medieval world, that survival was uncertain. This single factor explains much of the statistical gap between eras. Once past those early dangers, many individuals experienced long stretches of adult life, working, aging, and participating in stable communities. The endurance of medieval institutions reinforces this conclusion. Universities founded in the 12th and 13th centuries persisted for generations. Cathedrals required decades of coordinated labor. Legal systems evolved gradually, carried forward by adults who lived long enough to transmit knowledge. Such continuity presupposes a meaningful presence of middle-aged and elderly individuals. In the end, life expectancy during the Middle Ages reflects a balance between fragility and fortitude. It was a world where childhood was perilous, where epidemic disease could redraw demographic maps overnight, and where environmental change carried immediate consequences. Yet it was also a world sustained by cooperation, adaptation, and social structure. Many lives were cut short, many were not. When we move beyond the misleading simplicity of averages, we find a human landscape not defined by universal early death, but by conditional longevity. Medieval people faced sharper edges of risk than we do today. But within those edges, they built families, institutions, and traditions that endured across centuries. Their lifespans, though statistically shorter, were often long enough to shape history, and long enough to remind us that resilience, not merely duration, is what defines the arc of a life. As a final reflection, it helps to imagine how a medieval person might have understood the length of a life well lived. Without actuarial tables or census projections, longevity was perceived through memory and comparison. He lived longer than his father. She saw her grandchildren married. They survived the great sickness. These were the measures that mattered. Life expectancy, in a statistical sense, did not exist in their vocabulary, but survival and endurance certainly did. In many medieval villages, oral memory stretched back several generations. Elders could recount stories told to them by grandparents, linking present experience to events half a century earlier. That continuity would not have been possible in a society where almost no one survived past youth. The presence of living memory across decades confirms what demographic evidence also suggests. While early mortality was tragically common, adult longevity was far from rare. There is also a quiet but important truth in the material culture medieval people left behind. Tools worn smooth from decades of use. Marginal notes in manuscripts written in increasingly shaky hands. Repairs made again and again to the same dwelling. These traces speak of time accumulated. They speak of individuals who remained present long enough to maintain, adapt, and pass on. If we consider the psychological dimension, medieval attitudes toward death were both pragmatic and spiritual. Religious doctrine emphasized preparation for the afterlife, but it did not reject the value of earthly years. On the contrary, longevity was often interpreted as a blessing. Saints' lives sometimes highlighted advanced age as a mark of divine favor. Secular society, too, treated elderhood with a measure of respect, particularly when accompanied by property ownership or wisdom. From a broader historical perspective, medieval life expectancy fits into a long continuum of pre-modern demographic patterns. For most of human history, average lifespan at birth remained relatively low because childhood was dangerous and epidemics unpredictable. The transformation we now take for granted, where life expectancy commonly exceeds 70 or 80 years, emerged only recently in the last 2 centuries. That modern shift was revolutionary, not medieval conditions. Understanding this helps correct a subtle bias. It is tempting to view the Middle Ages as uniquely short-lived or unusually harsh. In reality, they reflect the typical constraints of a pre-industrial world. What makes them stand out are the dramatic plague waves of the 14th century and the depth of written and archaeological evidence available to historians. The combination of catastrophe and documentation gives us an unusually vivid picture of demographic shock and recovery. And recovery is the key word. After famine came planting. After plague came rebuilding. After war came restoration. Life expectancy dipped and rose with these cycles. It was not static. It was responsive. Medieval societies demonstrated remarkable capacity to adapt within their technological limits. So when we ask, in clear terms, what life expectancy was like during the Middle Ages, the answer must hold both sides at once. At birth, it was low compared to today, largely because many children did not survive their earliest years. Across the lifespan, it was unstable, vulnerable to environmental and epidemic disruption. But for those who survived childhood and avoided the worst crises, reaching middle age and often old age was entirely possible. The medieval world was not filled with people who routinely died at 30. It was filled with communities negotiating risk together, generation after generation. Some lives were heartbreakingly brief. Others stretched long enough to see profound change. And within that mixture of fragility and endurance lies the true story of medieval life expectancy. A story not of universal brevity, but of conditional longevity in a world where survival required resilience, cooperation, and patience with uncertainty. That, more than any single number, defines what it meant to grow old in the Middle Ages.